This is Wendy Baker on cultural differences in international trade. My credit goes to Gary Liu. He's the supply chain manager at Lippert and originally born in China. I'm very fortunate that the few items that I have to buy from China, I have this contact at our corporate headquarters. If there is communication difficulty on specs or details or revisions or even in paperwork, I can reach out to Gary and he can talk directly with the vendor and get it resolved. Gary also works closely with our R&D department and is involved in getting new products initially set up with Asian vendors, as well as doing all the paperwork and legwork when getting a new vendor added. One of the items him and I discussed was conflict and respect. That is important when dealing with a vendor in China and trying to avoid conflict. Most Chinese citizens try to avoid conflict at all costs, as well as respect is very important to them. This can relate to several ways when working with a Chinese company. One is that if there is a large meeting, whether in person or online, do not ask difficult questions that your contact might not be able to answer in front of their coworkers or boss. It is very important to leave those questions when you are one-on-one with your contact. If there's some conflict starting to arise with your contact, it is best to take a step back, talk about something else, life, family, etc., to relieve the tension. Once that tension is relieved, then you can circle back calmly to the issue at hand. Another issue that can cause conflict is trying to make someone admit whose mistake it is if something is wrong. The Chinese are even worse than wanting to admit a mistake than U.S. citizens in business. One of the other issues we discussed was new vendors. With working with a new vendor in China, there are some cultural differences to keep in mind. With a new vendor, and Asian contacts tend to want to get to know their U.S. contact on a personal level. They like to know who they are dealing with, what type of person, how they live, how they interact with family. Prior to COVID, there was a lot more traveling and meeting face-to-face in touring factories. Obviously, this was restricted, especially in China, the last 3 years. And because of the industry I'm in the late 2020 through early 22 was the busiest years ever. So there was a lot of adjustment to doing these initial introductions. Rank in family and business is a lot more important in China culture. In a meeting or out to dinner, the highest ranking person always gets the best seat. The one sitting around that person would also be high ranking. An example would be if I went to work in the US, I would be somewhat limited where I would sit. Obviously, as just a buyer, I would not take a seat next to my CEO since I work in a very large worldwide company, but it would be fine for me to sit with anyone from middle management. In China, if you were at a work dinner, the seating arrangement would much closer reflect the titles and position in the companies. Self and team was the other difference Gary and I discussed. In China, previously the culture was always about team. A person would not overly boast on their individual success at a company, especially compared to U.S. citizens. They would only consider the success of the company. The U.S. does push individual accomplishments, but Gary did say that this is slowly changing in the last 20 or so years in China. They are starting to express personal accomplishments more so than he had seen before.